never thought silence could be a privilege until the day I heard something that shouldn't exist inside a cremation retort at 1800 degrees. My name is Lucia Navarro, and I've operated the crematory at Westview Memorial Services in Eugene, Oregon for the past 11 years. Most people don't understand what we do here. They imagine something dark, something haunted by nature. But the truth is simpler and stranger than that. We provide the final service. We turn grief into ash, ceremony into completion. The work is technical, respectful, methodical. I've processed over 3,000 cremations in my career, and until Mrs. Eleanor Voss arrived in a simple pine casket on a Tuesday morning in late September, I had never heard the dead sing. The intake paperwork was routine. Eleanor Voss, 72 years old, cause of death listed as complications from throat cancer. No jewelry to remove, no pacemaker, no surgical implants that might interfere with the process. Her daughter had chosen a basic service, direct cremation with no viewing. The funeral director's notes mentioned she'd been a music teacher at Lincoln High School for 40 years. Choir director, voice coach, the kind of woman students remembered decades later. I wheeled her into the crematory at 9 in the morning. The retort was already preheated to operating temperature, the burners roaring their familiar industrial hymn. I've always found the sound comforting in its consistency, predictable, constant. I said a quiet blessing, nothing religious, just my own ritual, and engaged the conveyor system. The casket slid into the chamber. I sealed the door, checked the thermostat, and activated the primary burners. 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature where bone becomes brittle, where soft tissue disappears, where everything organic surrenders to heat and time. I settled into my chair with my logbook, noting the start time. 9:14 a.m. standard procedure calls for periodic monitoring. I glanced at the observation window every 15 minutes, watching the flames do their work through the reinforced glass. Everything progressed normally. The pine casket consumed quickly, as it should. The secondary burners kicked in at the 30-minute mark, maintaining the precise temperature needed for complete processing. At 9:47, I heard it, a hum, low and steady, rising from somewhere inside the chamber. I stood immediately, my chair scraping against the concrete floor. The mechanical systems produce their own symphony, burner roar, ventilation fans, the occasional pop of expanding metal, but this was different. This was melodic, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby, the kind you'd sing to a restless child at bedtime. I pressed my ear against the retort door, the metal warm but not burning through my protective sleeve. The humming continued, winding through the roar of the flames. It wasn't mechanical. It had phrasing, breath, intention, a melody I almost recognized but couldn't place. My hands were shaking when I pulled back. I checked every gauge, every readout, temperature steady at 1800 degrees, airflow normal, pressure within acceptable range. Nothing in the equipment could produce a sound like that. Nothing living could survive inside that chamber for more than seconds. I stood there for 3 minutes, listening. The hum rose and fell in gentle waves, patient and unhurried. I grabbed my phone and tried to record it, but the audio captured only the roar of the burners. When I played it back, the humming was gone, swallowed by industrial noise. The cremation continued. I forced myself to sit down, to log temperatures, to maintain the professional routine that had always steadied me. But every few minutes, I heard it again, that soft, impossible lullaby threading through the fire. At 11:32, the primary cycle completed. I shut down the burners and waited for the cool down period, watching the temperature gauge descend. The humming continued until the moment the flames died completely. Then silence, pure, absolute silence. I opened the retort door an hour later. The remains were normal, bone fragments, clean ash, nothing unusual. I processed them carefully, running everything through the cremulator to achieve the fine consistency families expect. My hands worked automatically while my mind circled the same questions. The urn was ready by 2 p.m. Eleanor Voss's daughter arrived 30 minutes later, a woman in her late 40s with her mother's sharp cheekbones and tired eyes. We sat in the family room while I explained the process, handed over the death certificate copies, answered the standard questions. Mom lost her voice 2 years before she died, the daughter said quietly, holding the urn in her lap. The cancer took her vocal cords. She couldn't speak, couldn't sing. It destroyed her. She'd spent her whole life teaching kids to use their voices, and hers just stopped. I nodded, professional and calm, while something cold settled in my chest. She used to hum this lullaby, the daughter continued, even after the surgery, even when she couldn't make any other sound. She'd try to hum it. It came out wrong, damaged, but she wouldn't stop trying. She hummed it the night before she died. She stood to leave, thanked me for my care, and walked out into the autumn afternoon. I sat in the empty family room for a long time after she left, listening to the building settle around me. I've processed 63 cremations since Eleanor Voss. The retort functions perfectly. The equipment logs show no anomalies. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the crematory during the final hour of a cremation, I hear it. That soft humming rising through the roar of the flames. It's faint now, easy to miss if you're not listening for it. But it's there. I don't tell anyone. What would I say? That the dead sing inside my retort? That fire doesn't silence everything? That some things persist beyond 1800 degrees? I just listen. And I hum along sometimes, very quietly, when I think no one can hear me. The melody is beautiful, sad, and patient, and strangely kind. I think Eleanor Voss got her voice back. I think she's teaching me how to use mine. I've checked every urn 3 times before sealing it for the past 8 months, and I still can't explain what happened to Thomas Brennan's ashes. My name is Raymond Lester, and I'm the lead crematory technician at Riverside Memorial Center in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I've held this position for 14 years, and in that time, I've developed systems, protocols, and safeguards that have never failed. Every body receives a metal identification tag that stays with the remains through the entire process. Every urn gets weighed, documented, and sealed in the presence of a witness. Every step gets logged, verified, and countersigned. I built these systems specifically to prevent the one nightmare every crematory operator fears: sending a family home with the wrong remains. Until last March, my perfect record held. Thomas Brennan came to us on a Friday evening, a 78-year-old veteran who died peacefully in his sleep. His son Marcus had chosen our premium service: witness cremation, hand-turned walnut urn, engraved nameplate. Marcus wanted to be present for the process, to see his father through this final transition. Some families need that closure. I understand it, and I respect it. Marcus arrived at 9 a.m. on Saturday. I walked him through what would happen, explained the timeline, showed him the observation room where he could watch through the viewing window. He seemed steady, prepared. He'd clearly thought this through. We began the cremation at 9:30. Marcus stood at the window the entire time, watching the flames, his hands pressed against the glass. I monitored the equipment from my station, checking temperatures, adjusting airflow, maintaining the precise conditions needed for a clean process. Everything proceeded normally. The cremation completed at 11:45. I let the retort cool, then carefully removed the remains and processed them through the cremulator. Thomas Brennan's identification tag was exactly where it should be, stamped with his case number and name. I transferred the ashes to the walnut urn Marcus had selected, using the same careful technique I've employed for 14 years. The urn filled completely, as expected for a man of Thomas Brennan's size and bone density. I placed it on the scale, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, standard range. I logged the weight in my records, sealed the urn with industrial adhesive, and attached the engraved nameplate. Marcus witnessed every step, nodding quietly as I worked. I handed him the urn at 1:15 p.m. He held it carefully, thanked me for my professionalism, and left with his father's remains secured in a velvet carrying case. The call came 3 days later. Marcus Brennan's voice was tight, confused rather than angry. "Mr. Lester, I need you to explain something. We opened Dad's urn at the memorial yesterday. We scattered half his ashes at the lake, where he proposed to my mother, but when we looked in the urn afterward, it was only about a third full. There should have been more." I felt my stomach drop. "That's not possible. I filled and sealed that urn myself. You watched me do it." "I know," Marcus said. "That's why I'm calling. I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need to understand what happened." I pulled the security footage immediately. Our cameras cover every angle of the crematory: the retort, the processing station, the sealing area. I've used this footage before to train new staff, to review procedures, to verify our protocols. The video showed exactly what I remembered. I processed Thomas Brennan's remains, transferred them to the urn, filled it to the appropriate level, and sealed it completely. Marcus stood at the observation window, watching everything. The timestamp matched my logs. 1:07 p.m., urn sealed. I watched the footage 3 times, studying every frame. The urn was full when I sealed it, completely full. 7 pounds, 4 ounces of cremated remains, properly processed and transferred, But Marcus Brennan wasn't lying. I know ashes. I know what a full urn looks like versus a partial one. And I know that industrial adhesive seal, once closed, it doesn't reopen without visible damage. I called Marcus back. Sir, I need to ask you something. Was the seal on the urn intact when you opened it? A pause. Yes, we had to cut it carefully. My sister wanted to save the nameplate. And the urn itself, any cracks, damage, anything unusual? No, it was perfect. That's what makes this so strange. I met with Marcus the following day. He brought the urn, still carrying the velvet case like he was protecting something precious. I examined it under workshop lighting. The seal had been cut cleanly, no signs of previous tampering. The walnut showed no cracks, no seams, no possible way for ashes to escape. The interior was clean, containing roughly a third of what should have been there. I weighed the remaining ashes, 2 pounds, 6 ounces. 5 pounds had disappeared. I checked our storage areas, thinking maybe I'd filled the wrong urn, left some remains behind. Nothing. I reviewed the cremulator logs, wondering if I'd miscalculated the processing. The numbers were correct. I even examined the retort itself, searching for some impossible scenario where ashes might have been lost during transfer. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the missing 5 pounds. Marcus and I sat in my office for an hour, turning over possibilities. He wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. He just wanted to understand. His father had served in Vietnam, raised 4 kids, buried his wife after 46 years of marriage. Marcus had promised his mother, dead now 6 years, that he'd scatter half of his father's ashes at that lake, the place where their love story began. I kept my promise, Marcus said quietly. I scattered the ashes, but there should have been more for my siblings. We were going to divide what remained, keep him close. Now there's barely enough for one person. I showed him the security footage. We watched together, frame by frame, the urn filling, the seal closing, his face in the observation window, witness to everything. I believe you, Marcus finally said. I believe you did everything right. I just don't understand where he went. Neither did I. Marcus took the remaining ashes home. I wrote up a detailed incident report, documenting everything I could document. I submitted it to management, expecting questions, investigations, maybe even disciplinary action. Nothing came of it. The report sits in a file somewhere, unexplained and unresolved. But I changed my procedures. Now I weigh every urn immediately, before sealing. Then I weigh it again after the adhesive sets, then a third time before the family arrives. I photograph the scale display at each checkpoint, time-stamped and archived. I've processed 216 cremations since Thomas Brennan. The weights always match. The seals always hold. The ashes stay exactly where they should be. But I think about those 5 of missing pounds every single day. I think about the security footage showing a full urn that somehow became a third full. I think about Marcus Brennan's face when he realized his father had disappeared somewhere between my crematory and that memorial service. I think about where those ashes went. And I wonder if Thomas Brennan had somewhere else he needed to be, some other promise to keep that none of us knew about. Sometimes the dead have their own plans. Sometimes they leave before we're ready to let them go. If you ever hear someone knocking from inside a cremation retort, don't stop the process to check, but I didn't know that rule until I broke it. My name is Denise Hartford, and I operate the crematory at Pinewood Memorial Services in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I've been doing this work for 9 years, long enough to understand that death follows patterns. Families grieve in predictable ways. Bodies decompose on reliable schedules. Equipment fails according to maintenance logs and warranty periods. Everything in this profession operates within expected boundaries, within most understood limits. Until the morning Robert Whitmore's body knocked 3 times from inside an 1800-degree fire. The intake arrived on a Wednesday. Robert Whitmore, 64 years old, sudden cardiac arrest while watching television. No trauma, no violence, just a heart that stopped without warning. His daughter Jennifer had selected a midweek cremation slot. No service, no viewing. She wanted it handled quickly and quietly. Some families need elaborate rituals. Others need swift completion. Both deserve the same care. I began the cremation process at 10:30 a.m. Standard procedure: preheat the retort, verify the identification tag, say my private blessing. Robert Whitmore slid into the chamber in a simple cardboard container, the kind we use for direct cremations. I sealed the door, activated the burners, and settled in to monitor the process. The first hour progressed normally. I updated records, cleaned the processing area, organized urns for afternoon pickups. The retort hummed its familiar industrial song, temperature steady at the target range. I've always found comfort in the routine, in the mechanical precision of the work we do here. At 11:43, I heard knocking. 3 deliberate knocks, slow and evenly spaced. The sound was clear, distinct from the mechanical noise of the crematory. It came from inside the retort chamber. I stood from my desk, listening. The knocking repeated. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same spacing. Knock, knock, knock. My training said this was impossible. At that temperature, with that much fire, nothing could produce a deliberate knocking pattern. Gases expanding in bone cavities might create pops or cracks. Metal remnants from casket hardware might ping as they heat. But this was different. This was purposeful. I checked the observation window. Flames filled the chamber, obscuring any clear view of the remains. Everything looked normal through the thick glass, just fire doing what fire does. The knocking came again. 3 times, patient and unhurried. I made a decision I've regretted for 8 months now. I shut down the primary burners and began the emergency cool-down sequence. Whatever was making that sound, I needed to verify the chamber was secure, that nothing had gone wrong with the process. Safety protocols exist for situations like this, procedures for unexpected events. The temperature dropped slowly. The knocking continued every 2 minutes, always 3 knocks, always the same rhythm. I stood at the control panel, watching the gauge descend, my heart beating in time with those impossible sounds. At 200 degrees, I opened the retort door. The chamber was exactly as it should be: partially cremated remains, ash, bone fragments, all in the expected configuration for a mid process interruption. Nothing out of place, nothing that could explain deliberate knocking sounds. I stared into that chamber for a full minute, searching for answers. The metal walls showed no damage. The remains showed no unusual positioning. Everything was normal, except for the silence. Now that the door was open, the knocking had stopped. I closed the retort and restarted the cremation cycle. The burners roared back to life, the temperature climbed, and I returned to my monitoring station. I logged the interruption in my records, noted the time, documented everything I'd observed. The knocking resumed at 12:15. 3 knocks, same pattern, same deliberate spacing. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't stop the process this time. I sat at my desk, listening, my pen frozen above the logbook. The knocking repeated every few minutes, patient and insistent, continuing until the cremation cycle completed at 1:37 p.m. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. I processed Robert Whitmore's remains with shaking hands, running everything through the cremulator, transferring the ashes to a temporary container. The metal identification tag was intact, confirming what I already knew. This was Robert Whitmore. This was the man who'd arrived that morning in a cardboard container. This was the man who'd knocked from inside my retort. Jennifer Whitmore arrived at 3 p.m. to collect her father's ashes. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes and the kind of quiet grief that doesn't need words. We sat in the family room while I handed over the urn and the necessary paperwork. Dad had this routine, she said suddenly, holding the urn in her lap. Every night before bed, he'd come to my room and knock 3 times on my door, always the three knocks, same rhythm. It was his way of saying goodnight, checking that I was okay. He did it when I was a kid, and he kept doing it even after I moved back home last year to help take care of him. She stared at the urn, her fingers tracing the smooth ceramic surface. The night he died, I was in my room reading. I heard 3 knocks on my door. I called out, "Good night, Dad," like I always did. But when I opened the door a few seconds later to ask if he wanted tea, he was already in the living room, already gone. The paramedics said he'd been dead at least 10 minutes, so who knocked on my door? I had no answer as I sat with her in that quiet room, listening to the building settle, feeling the weight of a question neither of us could answer. She left 20 minutes later, carrying her father in both arms like something precious and fragile and impossibly important. I stayed late that night, cleaning the crematory, organizing supplies, doing all the small maintenance tasks I usually postpone. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to be alone with what I'd heard. But eventually, I had to go home. I've processed 93 cremations since Robert Whitmore. I listened carefully during every cycle, monitoring not just the equipment, but the sounds themselves. Most cremations progress in perfect silence, just the industrial roar of fire and machinery. But sometimes, maybe once every dozen cremations, I hear it. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the retort chamber. Always 3 knocks, always the same rhythm. I don't stop the process anymore. I just listen. I log it in my private notes, documenting a phenomenon I can't explain and won't report. I imagine families somewhere hearing 3 knocks on their doors late at night, hearing that familiar pattern one more time. I think about Jennifer Whitmore's question: who knocked on her door after her father was already dead? And I think I know the answer now. Some people leave behind routines stronger than death itself. Some habits persist beyond fire, beyond endings, beyond every boundary we think defines what's possible. Robert Whitmore still checks on his daughter. He knocks 3 times to say goodnight. And somewhere in Grand Rapids, I hope Jennifer hears him. I hope she knows he's still there. I started keeping a logbook of temperatures that shouldn't exist, and what I discovered scared me more than any ghost story ever could. My name is Felix Romero, and I manage the crematory operations at Clearwater Memorial Park in Tacoma, Washington. I've overseen this facility for 16 years, working with equipment that operates at temperatures most people can't comprehend. 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, the point where organic matter surrenders to physics, where human remains transform into ash and bone fragments. I know heat. I understand fire. I've spent nearly 2 decades making sure both behave exactly as they should. So when Retort 3 started producing cold that defied every law of thermodynamics I understand, I didn't believe it at first. The problem began in late October, subtle enough that I almost dismissed it. During a routine cremation, I noticed the temperature readout on Retort 3 fluctuating slightly. Nothing dramatic, just small drops of 10 or 15 degrees that corrected themselves quickly. I made a note to call our maintenance contractor, thinking we had a failing thermocouple or calibration issue. But when I stepped close to Retort 3 to check the door seal, I felt cold air radiating from the chamber, cold air from a retort running at 1800 degrees. I pulled back immediately, assuming I'd imagined it. Heat exhaustion, maybe, or the contrast between the crematory's ambient temperature and the extreme heat of the equipment. I've seen new employees experience a similar perceptual confusion during their first weeks. But when I held my hand near the retort door, careful not to touch, just testing the air, I felt it again. A pocket of frigid air, about 3 feet in diameter, centered directly in front of retort 3. I checked the other retorts. 1 and 2 radiated normal heat, the kind that makes you step back, that reminds you to respect the equipment. Only 3 produced this impossible cold zone. The cremation completed normally, the remains processed without issue. The temperature logs showed only minor fluctuations, nothing that would indicate equipment failure. But that cold pocket persisted for exactly 4 minutes after the cycle finished, then vanished as if it had never existed. I called our maintenance contractor the next morning. 2 technicians spent 6 hours examining Retort 3, checking burners, inspecting refractory brick, testing thermocouples, analyzing airflow patterns. They found nothing wrong. The retort functioned perfectly according to every metric they could measure. Maybe you've got a cold draft coming from somewhere, the lead technician suggested. Weird HVAC interaction, pressure differential. Old buildings do strange things. But Clearwater Memorial isn't an old building. We rebuilt this facility 12 years ago with modern climate control and proper ventilation, and the cold spot didn't come from a draft. It came from the retort itself. The anomaly continued, not with every cremation, which made it harder to track. Some days, Retort 3 operated normally, producing the expected heat patterns. Other days, that impossible cold zone appeared, always in the same location, always lasting exactly 4 minutes. I started documenting everything, not in our official logs. Those needed to remain professional, focused on regulatory compliance and operational standards, but in a private notebook I kept locked in my desk. Date, time, deceased's name, cause of death, duration of cold spot, ambient temperature readings. Patterns emerged after 3 months. The cold spot only appeared during cremations of people who died in accidents, car crashes, falls, drownings, workplace incidents. Any death ruled accidental by the medical examiner's office triggered the anomaly. Natural deaths, suicides, homicides, all processed normally. But accidents brought the cold. I didn't want to believe it. I'm a crematory manager, not a paranormal investigator. I work with combustion efficiency and environmental regulations, not supernatural phenomena. But the pattern held across 67 cremations, 0 exceptions. I stopped assigning Retort 3 to accidental deaths. I routed those cases to Retorts 1 and 2 instead, making excuses about maintenance schedules and processing optimization. My staff noticed the change, but didn't question it. Good employees trust their manager's judgment. But in January, we had an equipment failure. Retort 2's primary burner malfunctioned during a busy week, leaving us with only retorts 1 and 3 operational. We had 8 cremations scheduled, including 2 accidental deaths. A construction worker who'd fallen from scaffolding, and a teenager who'd drowned in a swimming pool. I had no choice. I assigned both cases to Retort 3. The construction worker's cremation began at 9 a.m. I monitored it personally, standing at the control panel with my private notebook ready. The process started normally, temperature climbing, combustion steady, no anomalies. At 9:47, the cold hit. It wasn't subtle this time. The temperature in front of Retort 3 dropped so fast I could see my breath. The air turned glacial, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I grabbed the infrared thermometer from my toolkit and aimed it at the cold zone. 42 degrees Fahrenheit, in front of a retort chamber running at 1800 degrees. I documented everything with shaking hands. The cold spot lasted exactly 4 minutes, then dissolved like morning fog in sunlight. The cremation completed normally. The remains showed no unusual characteristics. The teenager's cremation followed that afternoon. Same phenomenon. Same impossible temperature drop. Same 4-minute duration. I stood in that frigid air both times, feeling the cold seep into my bones while fire roared 3 feet away. It felt wrong on a level I couldn't articulate. Not just physically impossible, but existentially wrong, like standing in a place where the rules of reality had been temporarily suspended. That night, I researched accident statistics, looking for something that might explain what I'd documented. I found plenty of data about accidental deaths, frequency, common causes, demographic patterns, but nothing about temperature anomalies, nothing about cold spots appearing during cremation. I found something else, though, a psychology paper about trauma and unfinished business, about how accidental deaths leave survivors with unanswered questions. No time for goodbyes. No chance for preparation. Just sudden absence, sudden silence, sudden cold where warmth used to be. I thought about that construction worker's family, about that teenager's parents. I thought about how they'd describe the loss, the cold shock of it, the way grief hits like freezing water when death comes without warning, and I wondered if that cold spot in front of Retort 3 was trying to tell me something. Retort 2 came back online 2 weeks later. I resumed my original assignment protocols, routing accidental deaths away from Retort 3. The cold spot still appears occasionally. I've felt it 6 times in the past 3 months, but I don't fight it anymore. I've processed over 2,000 cremations in my career. I understand combustion, heat transfer, and the physics of fire. But I've learned that some phenomena exist outside the boundaries of what we can measure or explain. The cold lasts exactly 4 minutes, like the time it takes for warmth to leave a body after the heart stops, like the moment when everything that was warm becomes suddenly impossibly cold. I still keep my private logbook, still document every occurrence, but I've stopped trying to fix what isn't broken. Some things aren't equipment failures. Some things are just grief, manifesting in ways we never expected, finding its way into the only place it has left. The first time I saw someone who wasn't there, I thought exhaustion was playing tricks on my eyes, but reflection errors don't show up in memorial photographs. My name is Mara Chen, and I work as a crematory technician at Riverside Memorial Services in Portland, Oregon. I've held this position for 7 years, processing an average of 12 cremations per week with the kind of careful precision this work demands. We serve families in their darkest moments, and that responsibility requires absolute focus. No mistakes, no carelessness, no room for the kind of error that haunts you for years afterward. I've never made a mistake with someone's remains, never confused identifications, never lost ashes, never damaged an urn. My record is spotless. But I saw someone who died a decade ago standing in my observation room, watching me cremate her father, and I don't know if that counts as an error or something worse. It happened on a Tuesday in March. The deceased was Martin Holloway, 81 years old, died peacefully after a long battle with Parkinson's disease. His son David had arranged for a witness cremation, wanting to be present for the process. Some families need that final vigil. I understand it. I've stood with countless family members as they watched through the observation window, bearing witness to a father, mother, spouse, or child making that final transition. David Holloway arrived at 9:30 a.m., accompanied by his wife. They were quiet, composed, the kind of grieving that sits deep and doesn't need outward expression. I walked them through what would happen, explained the timeline, showed them to the observation room, a small space with a large tempered glass window looking directly into the retort chamber. The cremation began at 9:45. I activated the conveyor system, and Martin Holloway's casket slid into the chamber. The flames rose immediately, bright and purifying. David and his wife stood at the window, holding hands, watching in silence. I returned to my monitoring station 15 feet away, logging start times and checking temperature gauges. Everything proceeded normally. The retort climbed to operating temperature. The burners maintained steady combustion. Martin Holloway's body began its transformation from physical form to elemental ash. At 10:23, I glanced toward the observation window to check on the family. 3 people stood there instead of 2. A young woman in a dark blue dress had joined them, standing slightly behind and to the left of David Holloway. She stared through the glass with intense focus, her face pale and solemn, her hands clasped in front of her chest. I looked away, then back. 3 people: David, his wife, and this stranger who'd entered without me hearing the door. I stood, planning to approach and verify she was authorized to be present. Witness cremations are private services, restricted to immediate family only. But as I rounded my desk, David Holloway turned from the window, and I saw his face clearly. Just 2 people stood in that observation room: David and his wife, no one else. I stopped mid-step, confusion breaking through my professional composure. I looked directly at the window. 3 figures, clearly visible: David in his dark suit, his wife in gray, and the young woman in blue, all watching the flames. I blinked hard, assuming fatigue or eye strain. When I opened my eyes, 2 people. When I glanced away and back, 3 people. My heart started pounding. I've worked with death long enough to know the mind plays tricks under stress. Grief creates shadows. Exhaustion produces illusions. I'd logged a 60-hour week, covering for a colleague's medical leave. This was clearly some perceptual glitch, my brain filling in gaps with phantom images. But the young woman looked so real, so solid, so intensely present as she watched Martin Holloway burn. I forced myself to stay at my station, monitoring the cremation while periodically glancing toward the observation window. The phenomenon continued for 40 minutes. Sometimes I saw her, sometimes I didn't. The pattern seemed random, uncontrollable, like my vision was alternating between 2 different versions of reality. The cremation completed at 12:15. I began the cool-down process while David and his wife remained at the window, bearing witness until the end. The young woman, when I could see her, stood with them, never moving, never speaking, just watching with that same focused intensity. David and his wife left the observation room at 12:30. 2 people walked out. I verified it carefully, counting as they passed my station. 2. I processed Martin Holloway's remains with shaking hands, running everything through the cremulator, transferring the ashes to the urn David had selected. My vision behaved normally during this work. No phantom figures, no perceptual errors, just the routine tasks I'd performed thousands of times. David returned at 2 p.m. to collect his father's ashes. His wife wasn't with him this time. We sat in the family room while I explained the paperwork, handed over the urn, answered his quiet questions about the process. My sister couldn't make it today, David said suddenly. She wanted to be here, wanted to see Dad through this, but she passed away 10 years ago. Car accident. She was only 27. Something cold settled in my chest. I'm sorry, I managed. Sarah loved Dad so much, David continued, holding the urn gently. She was his favorite, though he'd never admit it. They had this connection, you know. After she died, Dad kept a photograph of her on his bedside table, never moved it, never stopped talking to it. He pulled out his phone, swiped through photos. This is Sarah. I'm setting up a memorial table at the service tomorrow. Thought I'd put her picture next to Dad's. He turned the phone toward me. The young woman in the dark blue dress stared out from the screen. Same pale face, same solemn expression, same intense focus I'd seen through the observation window. Beautiful, wasn't she? David said. I miss her every day. I kept thinking about her this morning during the cremation, wishing she could have been there, wishing she could have said goodbye. I nodded, unable to speak, staring at that photograph while my professional composure crumbled into something close to terror. David left at 2:30, carrying his father's ashes and his sister's photograph. I sat alone in the family room for a long time afterward, listening to the building settle around me, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I checked the security footage that evening. Our cameras cover the observation room, recording every witness cremation for liability purposes. I pulled up the morning's recording and watched the entire session. 2 people in the observation room, David Holloway and his wife, no one else. The camera never showed a young woman in a dark blue dress, never captured her entering, standing, or watching, just 2 people, witnessed and verified and completely, undeniably real, but I saw 3. I've processed 94 cremations since Martin Holloway. I watched the observation room carefully during every witness service, counting family members, verifying who enters and leaves. Most of the time, my vision behaves normally. I see exactly what's there, nothing more. But sometimes, during certain cremations, I see additional mourners, extra witnesses standing in impossible spaces, watching with that same intense focus I saw in Sarah Holloway's face. They appear and disappear at random, visible for seconds, before my perception shifts and they're gone. I started researching the deceased after these occurrences, checking obituaries and family information. Every time I see an extra mourner, I find a match. A dead daughter watching her mother's cremation, a deceased spouse standing vigil for his wife, a lost child present for her father's final journey. They're always connected to the deceased, always significant relationships, always people who should have been there but couldn't be because they'd already made this same journey themselves. I don't report these sightings. What would I say? that I see dead people watching other dead people burn, that my perception occasionally includes mourners who exist outside normal reality. That would end my career and possibly land me in mandatory counseling. So I just watch. I count carefully. I verify numbers against security footage, and I take comfort in knowing that no one truly burns alone, that sometimes the people we loved most find a way to be present for our final moments, even when physics and time say it's impossible. Sarah Holloway watched her father's cremation. I saw her. I know I did. The camera couldn't capture her, but that doesn't mean she wasn't there. Some witnesses exist beyond what technology can record. Some goodbyes happen in spaces between perception and reality. And sometimes the dead come home to say farewell, even if only one person can see them standing there. I've cremated fire chiefs, firefighters, and burn victims before, but I'd never watched flames hesitate until the day Thomas Garrett came through my retort. My name is Vincent Aldridge, and I've operated the crematory at Maplewood Memorial Services in Sacramento, California for the past 13 years. In that time, I've learned that fire is the most predictable element in this profession. Feed it oxygen, maintain temperature, and it consumes everything with mechanical efficiency. Fire doesn't think, it doesn't choose. It burns according to the laws of chemistry and physics, converting organic matter to ash with absolute consistency until it doesn't. Thomas Garrett arrived on a Thursday morning in early April. The paperwork told his story in clinical terms. 62 years old, fire chief for Sacramento County, died in the line of duty while rescuing a child from a residential fire. Third-degree burns over 70% of his body. Smoke inhalation, cardiac arrest, the kind of death that makes the evening news, that brings hundreds to the funeral, that turns a man into a hero. His cremation was scheduled for 10 a.m. His widow had requested no viewing. The fire had taken that possibility away, but she wanted to know the exact time of the cremation so she could sit in prayer while it happened. Some families need that synchronicity, that sense of being present, even when they're miles away. I preheated the retort at 9:30, following my standard procedure. The burners roared to life, climbing steadily toward operational temperature. Everything functioned normally. The equipment showed no signs of malfunction or irregularity. I wheeled Thomas Garrett into the crematory at 9:55. He was sealed in a combustible casket, as specified by his widow. I said my usual blessing, nothing formal, just my own private acknowledgement of the person who'd been the life that had ended. Then I engaged the conveyor system. The casket entered the retort at exactly 10 a.m. The flames should have consumed it immediately. Wood ignites fast at 1800 degrees. The casket should have burned away in minutes, exposing the remains to direct heat. But the flames moved slowly. I noticed it within the first 30 seconds. The fire surrounded the casket, but didn't attack it with normal aggression. Instead, the flames seemed to lap at the wood gently, almost carefully, like they were reluctant to consume what lay inside. I checked every gauge on my control panel. Temperature 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly where it should be. Oxygen flow, optimal. Gas pressure, normal. Every metric indicated the retort was functioning at peak efficiency, but the fire moved like it was underwater. I stood at the observation window, watching flames behave in ways that violated everything I understood about combustion. They surrounded the casket completely, but they burned with strange gentleness, consuming wood at perhaps that's half the normal rate. Casket's corners should have collapsed within 5 minutes. Instead, they held their shape, surrendering to the fire one grain at a time. 20 minutes passed. The casket was still structurally intact. Charred, yes, blackened by heat, but whole in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I considered stopping the process, calling a technician, documenting an equipment failure, but every reading said the retort was working perfectly. The problem wasn't the equipment, the problem was the fire itself. At the 40-minute mark, the casket finally collapsed. The flames reached Thomas Garrett's remains and began the process of reducing human tissue to ash and bone. But even then, the fire moved differently. The usual quick consumption stretched into something prolonged, almost ceremonial. I've cremated fire victims before. Burns don't change how a body processes. The fire in my retort doesn't care what the fire outside did to someone. Death equalizes everyone in my chamber, reducing all human remains to the same basic elements at the same basic rate. But Thomas Garrett's cremation took 3 hours and 40 minutes. A standard cremation takes 2 to 3 hours, depending on body mass and bone density. Thomas Garrett had been a lean man, maybe 170 pounds, before the fire that killed him. His cremation should have completed in under 2.5 hours. Instead, I watched flames move with that same strange reluctance for 3 hours and 40 minutes, consuming him so slowly that I checked the equipment 6 times, certain something had malfunctioned. Nothing had malfunctioned. The fire just didn't want to burn him. I processed his remains at 1:40 p.m., running the bone fragments through the cremulator, transferring the ashes to the urn his widow had selected. Everything looked normal at this stage. The remains showed no unusual characteristics, no physical evidence of the delay I'd witnessed. But I couldn't stop thinking about those flames. The way they'd moved like they were being careful, like they were showing respect to one of their own. I filed my paperwork that evening, documenting start and end times without commentary about the delay. What would I write? Fire behaved unusually. Flames showed reluctance. Those phrases belonged in ghost stories, not crematory logs. But I couldn't let it go. I spent the evening researching Thomas Garrett, reading news articles about the rescue that killed him. The details were straightforward: residential fire, second-floor bedroom, 8-year-old girl trapped by flames and smoke. Thomas Garrett entered the building after his crew said it was too dangerous, climbed through a window, reached the child, got her to safety. The building collapsed 30 seconds after he passed her to firefighters outside. He died on the way to the hospital, his body so badly burned that identification required dental records. The articles called him a hero. His crew called him fearless. His widow called him stubborn and selfless and too brave for his own good. And I thought about fire, about how Thomas Garrett had spent 30 years commanding it, controlling it, understanding it better than most people ever would, about how he died in flames, sacrificed to the element he dedicated his life to mastering, about how the fire in my retort had burned him so carefully, so reluctantly, like it didn't want to claim one of its own. I've processed 218 cremations since Thomas Garrett. Most proceed at normal speed, normal temperature, normal consumption rates. The fire behaves as fire should, following the predictable patterns that have defined my career. But I had another firefighter last month, retired, died of cancer, never burned on the job. His cremation took 4 hours, and I had a burn victim 3 weeks ago, a woman who'd survived a house fire only to die from complications 6 months later. Her cremation stretched to 3.5 hours. I don't log these delays in any official capacity. I just note them in my private records, tracking a pattern that shouldn't exist, documenting a phenomenon I can't explain. The fire knows. Somehow, it recognizes those who've been touched by flame, those who've died in smoke and heat, those who've commanded fire or been consumed by it. And it treats them differently. It burns them slowly, carefully, with something that almost looks like reverence. I don't understand it. I've stopped trying to understand it. I just watch the flames and notice when they hesitate, when they remember, when they show mercy to their own. Thomas Garrett was a hero who died in fire, and the fire in my retort honored him the only way it knew how, by taking its time, by burning him gently, by letting him go slowly, reluctantly, like saying goodbye to someone who'd earned respect. I think about his widow, sitting in prayer that Thursday morning, feeling connected to her husband during his final transformation. I wonder if she felt it too. The strange slowness, the careful flames, the fire saying farewell to one of its own. The ventilation system in a crematory produces many sounds, but rhythmic breathing isn't supposed to be one of them until I learned that some habits outlive the body. My name is Clara Dennison, and I work as a crematory technician at Riverbend Memorial Services in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been in this profession for 8 years, long enough to know every sound this facility produces. The roar of burners, the hum of ventilation fans, the mechanical click of temperature regulators, the soft whoosh of air moving through filtration systems. I can identify each sound by ear, diagnose problems before gauges register them, distinguish normal operation from equipment failure. So when I heard breathing through the ventilation ducts, I knew immediately it shouldn't be there. The deceased was Eleanor Packard, 77 years old, died after 6 months on a ventilator following complications from pneumonia. Her daughter had chosen an early morning cremation, wanting it handled before the day's other services. I arrived at 6:30 a.m. to begin preparations, preheating the retort and reviewing the intake paperwork. Eleanor's medical history was straightforward: progressive respiratory failure, mechanical ventilation, gradual decline, final organ shutdown. The kind of slow death that gives families time to say goodbye but also time to suffer through watching someone disappear one breath at a time. I began the cremation at 7:15. The morning was quiet, just me and the equipment, the way I prefer it. No interruptions, no distractions, just the focused work of providing dignified final care. Eleanor Packard's casket slid into the retort chamber, and I sealed the door, activated the burners, and settled in to monitor the process. The ventilation system engaged immediately, as it always does. The crematory produces gases and particulate matter that must be filtered and exhausted safely. Our system is powerful and well maintained, pulling air through multiple stages of filtration before releasing it into the atmosphere. It creates a constant background noise I've long since learned to ignore. But at 7:43, I heard something underneath that familiar mechanical drone, breathing, in, in, out, rhythmic, steady, mechanical. I stood from my desk, listening carefully. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from the ventilation duct that ran along the crematory's east wall. It didn't sound organic exactly, more like air moving through a controlled system, regular and precise, like a ventilator. I walked to the duct and pressed my ear against the metal. The breathing sound was clearer here, mixing with the normal airflow, but maintaining its own distinct pattern. In through the inhale, out through the exhale, timed with mechanical precision. I checked the ventilation controls. Everything operated normally. Fan speed optimal, pressure differential within range, filtration system clear. No blockages, no malfunctions, no reason for the equipment to produce a rhythmic breathing pattern. But the sound continued. I grabbed my toolbox and opened the access panel on the nearest duct section. The interior was clean, free of debris or blockages. The fan blades turned smoothly. Nothing physical could explain what I was hearing. I closed the panel and returned to my monitoring station. The breathing persisted, background noise underneath the mechanical systems. In, out, in, out. Never varying, never pausing, just that steady rhythm that shouldn't exist. At 8:30, I began checking other parts of the facility. The viewing rooms were silent. The preparation areas showed no unusual sounds. Every duct I checked produced normal ventilation noise, except the one running past the crematory. That duct breathed. I considered calling maintenance, but what would I report? The ventilation system sounds like someone breathing. They'd check the equipment, find nothing wrong, and suggest I'd been working too many early shifts. The cremation completed at 9:45. I began the cool-down process, watching temperature gauges descend while that impossible breathing continued in the background. It didn't stop when the burners shut down. It didn't pause when the retort opened. It just kept going, steady and patient, and utterly unexplainable. I processed Eleanor Packard's remains, with that sound filling the crematory, providing a rhythm to my work. In, out, in, out. I ran the bone fragments through the cremulator, transferred the ashes to the urn her daughter had selected, cleaned my equipment for the next cremation. The breathing followed me through every task. Eleanor's daughter arrived at 11 to collect the ashes. We sat in the family room while I handled the paperwork, explained the process, answered her quiet questions. She seemed tired, hollowed out by months of watching her mother die, one labored breath at a time. Mom was on that ventilator for 183 days, she said softly. I counted every one. Toward the end, I'd sit by her bed and just listen to the machine breathe for her. It made this sound, this rhythm, in and out, in and out. I heard it in my sleep. I heard it when I was driving. I couldn't escape it. She held the urn carefully, her fingers tracing the smooth surface. When they finally turned off the ventilator, the silence was worse than the sound. I kept waiting to hear the next breath, but it never came. The machine stopped, and Mom stopped, and everything was just quiet. I walked her to her car, helped her secure the urn safely, watched her drive away carrying all that remained of her mother. Then I went back inside and heard the Eleanor Packard breathing through my ventilation system. I called maintenance that afternoon. 2 technicians spent 4 hours examining every duct, every fan, every component of the ventilation system. They found nothing wrong. Perfect operation, they said. No blockages, no mechanical issues, no explanation for unusual sounds. Maybe you're hearing the natural airflow pattern, one suggested. Sometimes ducts can create rhythmic sounds, depending on pressure and velocity. But natural airflow doesn't sound like a ventilator, doesn't maintain that precise mechanical rhythm, doesn't breathe in and out with measured, regulated timing. The technicians left at 6 p.m. The breathing continued. I've processed 96 cremations since Eleanor Packard. The ventilation system functions perfectly, passing every inspection and maintenance check. But that duct still breathes, still maintains its steady rhythm during certain cremations. I started keeping records. The breathing appears during cremations of patients who died on ventilators, respiratory failure, neuromuscular diseases, comas. Any death that involved mechanical breathing assistance triggers the phenomenon. It never appears with other deaths, just those who'd relied on machines to breathe for them. I bought a white noise machine 3 months ago. I run it constantly now, positioning it near my monitoring station to mask the sound. It helps. The breathing becomes background noise, easier to ignore, less intrusive, but I still hear it sometimes, during quiet moments, between cremations, when I'm alone in the facility doing paperwork or cleaning equipment. That steady rhythm emerges from behind the white noise, persistent and patient. In, out, in, out. I think about Eleanor Packard, about the 183 days she spent connected to a machine that breathed for her, about how that rhythm became her existence, her entire world reduced to mechanical inhalation and exhalation, about how her daughter couldn't escape that sound, even in sleep, about how some patterns become so deeply ingrained they persist beyond the body that needed them. I don't report the breathing anymore. I don't call maintenance or ask colleagues if they hear it too. I just run my white noise machine and do my work and accept that some sounds belong to this place now. The crematory breathes for those who couldn't breathe on their own. It maintains the rhythm they depended on, the mechanical pattern that kept them alive. It remembers. And somewhere in the ventilation system, beneath the normal sounds of fans and filters and moving air, Eleanor Packard is still breathing. Steady, mechanical, eternal, in, out, never stopping, never pausing, still connected to the machine that once defined her existence. I hear it now, even over the white noise, the sound of someone who forgot how to stop breathing, who couldn't let go of the rhythm that kept her alive, who still depends on machines to help her remember in, out, in, out, forever. I've worked with computer-controlled cremation systems for 12 years, but I'd never seen equipment restart itself mid-cycle until the morning David Chen's fail-safe protocols followed him into death. My name is James Whitmore, and I operate the crematory at Eastside Memorial Park in Seattle, Washington. Our facility uses state-of-the-art digital control systems, computerized temperature regulation, and automated process monitoring. Everything runs through a central processor that tracks every variable, logs every parameter, and ensures consistent, reliable cremation from start to finish. It's the most advanced system I've worked with in my career. It's also the system that reset itself 3 times during a single cremation, erasing its own records while I watched. David Chen arrived on a Wednesday morning. The intake paperwork described him as 54 years old, tech developer, died of sudden cardiac arrest in his home office. His wife had found him lumped over his keyboard, gone before the paramedics could arrive. The kind of death that happens too young, too fast, leaving questions instead of answers. I read through his background as part of my routine preparation. David had worked for a medical technology company, designing fail-safe systems for hospital equipment, life support machines, monitoring devices, critical care systems where failure meant death. His specialty was building redundancy into software, creating safeguards that would prevent catastrophic errors. He'd spent his career making sure machines didn't fail. I began his cremation at 9:30 a.m. The computer system initialized normally, running through its startup sequence, confirming all subsystems operational, temperature control, online, gas flow regulation, online, safety interlocks, online, process logging, online. I entered David Chen's case information, confirmed his identification tag, and activated the primary cycle. The retort door sealed, the burners ignited. The computer began tracking the cremation in real time, recording temperature curves, gas consumption, elapsed time. Everything proceeded perfectly for 18 minutes. At 9:48, the entire system shut down. Not a power failure. The lights stayed on, the ventilation continued running. Everything else in the facility functioned normally. Just the cremation control system. It went completely dark for 3 seconds, then rebooted itself. The display screen lit up with the startup sequence. Temperature control, online. Gas flow regulation, online. Safety interlocks, online. Process logging, online. The burners reignited automatically. The computer picked up exactly where it had stopped, maintaining the cremation without apparent interruption. I immediately checked the equipment room. The main breaker showed no trip. The UPS battery backup indicated continuous power. The network logs showed no disconnection, no voltage fluctuations, no external event that might explain a spontaneous reboot. The system had simply decided to restart itself. I documented the incident in my logbook, noting the exact time and duration of the interruption. Then I returned to monitoring the cremation, watching the display carefully for any signs of malfunction. At 10:23, it happened again. Complete shutdown, 3 seconds of darkness, startup sequence, burners reigniting, process continuing as if nothing had interrupted it. I grabbed my phone and started recording the display screen. If this happened a third time, I'd need video evidence for the service technician. The computer showed no error codes, no warning messages, no indication anything had gone wrong. But the system had reset twice during a single cremation. That shouldn't be possible. These systems include multiple safeguards specifically designed to prevent mid-process shutdowns. Even during power failures, the UPS backup should maintain operations long enough for a controlled shutdown sequence. I checked the process log. Empty. No record of the cremation I was currently monitoring. No timestamp for when it started. No temperature readings. No documentation that David Chen had ever entered the retort. The computer had erased its own memory. At 11:09, the third reset occurred. I watched it happen, phone recording every second. The display went dark. 3 seconds of silence. Then the startup sequence. Temperature control, online. Gas flow regulation, online. Safety interlocks, online. Process logging, online. The burners returned to life. The cremation continued. I played back my phone recording immediately. The video showed exactly what I'd witnessed. Clear, undeniable documentation of a system spontaneously rebooting during active operation. But when I checked the computer's internal logs after the cremation completed, they showed nothing. No record of the resets, no error messages, no indication the system had experienced any interruption whatsoever. According to the computer, David Chen's cremation had proceeded perfectly from start to finish. Continuous operation, no anomalies, no restarts. I had video evidence proving otherwise. I completed the cremation manually, trusting my own observations rather than the computer's claims. I processed David Chen's remains, transferred them to the urn his wife had selected, and cleaned the equipment for the next service. Then I spent 2 hours trying to understand what had happened. I examined every component of the control system. Hardware, functioning perfectly. Software, current version, no corruption detected. Connections, secure and stable. The system passed every diagnostic test I could run. I reviewed the backup logs stored on our network server. They confirmed what the main computer claimed. Continuous operation, no interruptions, perfect cremation cycle. But my phone video clearly showed 3 complete system resets. I called the equipment manufacturer's technical support line. After explaining the situation, they walked me through advanced diagnostics, checking subsystems I didn't even know existed. Everything tested normal. Maybe you experienced some kind of electromagnetic interference, the technician suggested. Though that shouldn't affect our systems, they're shielded specifically to prevent external disruption. What about internal events? I asked. Could something in the cremation process itself trigger a reset? Not possible. The control system is completely isolated from the retort chamber. There's no mechanism for anything happening inside to affect the computer. But something had affected it 3 times. David Chen's wife arrived at 2 p.m. to collect his ashes. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 40s, composed despite obvious grief. We sat in the family room while I explained the process and handled the paperwork. David was obsessed with failure prevention, she said quietly. His whole career was about building systems that couldn't fail, creating redundancy and safeguards. He worked 80-hour weeks sometimes, testing every scenario, anticipating every possible error. She held the urn carefully, her fingers tracing the engraved nameplate. He died at his computer, you know. The coroner said he'd been working on code when his heart stopped. They found him still typing, still trying to solve some problem even as he was dying. That was David, always trying to prevent the next failure, always building in one more safeguard. What kind of systems did he work on? I asked. Hospital equipment mostly, life support systems, monitoring devices, anything where failure could kill someone. He designed fail-safe protocols that would reset equipment if it detected critical errors, restart processes to prevent catastrophic outcomes. He saved a lot of lives with that work. She stood to leave, thanked me for my care, and walked out carrying her husband's ashes. I sat alone in the family room for a long time afterward, thinking about fail-safe systems, about software designed to detect critical errors and automatically reset to prevent failure, about a man who'd spent his career building those protocols, teaching machines to save themselves by starting over, about how those same protocols might follow someone beyond death. I've processed 73 cremations since David Chen. The computer system functions perfectly, logging every cremation without issue, but I keep my phone chitaged and ready, positioned to record the display screen during every cycle, just in case it happens again, just in case someone else who worked with fail-safe systems arrives in my retort. I think about David Chen dying at his keyboard, still coding, still building safeguards even as his body shut down. And I wonder if some part of him recognized my cremation system as equipment that needed protection, as a process that required fail-safe protocols, as a system that might fail without proper oversight. I wonder if he's still preventing failures, still resetting processes that might go wrong, still protecting the machines even after the machines couldn't protect him. The computer says the resets never happened, but I have video evidence. And somewhere in the code, buried beneath layers of normal operation, I think David Chen is still working, still building safeguards, still trying to prevent the next catastrophic failure, still resetting systems that need correction. Still there, in the machine, forever. I felt someone leaning against the retort door from the inside during a cremation at 1800 degrees, and I still can't explain why the pressure stopped the moment his wife arrived. My name is Nadia Torres, and I work as a crematory technician at Highland Memorial Services in Denver, Colorado. I've been in this position for 6 years, handling an average of 10 cremations per week with the kind of steady professionalism this work demands. The retort door is industrial steel, designed to withstand extreme temperatures and pressure. It weighs approximately 200 pounds and seals with mechanical precision that requires significant force to engage or release. Nothing should be able to push against it from the inside. Not at operating temperature, not during active cremation, not ever. But on a Tuesday morning in late September, I felt steady pressure against that door, as if someone was leaning their full weight against the steel, trying to get out. The deceased was Martin Holloway, 71 years old, died peacefully in his sleep after a long battle with COPD. His wife, Patricia, had arranged for a simple cremation scheduled for 10 a.m. No service, no viewing, just the quiet completion of final arrangements. Martin had been a quiet man, according to the intake notes, retired postal worker, devoted husband, someone who lived his life without drama or attention, someone who waited by the door. I began the cremation on schedule, the retort preheated to operating temperature, the identification tag was verified, and Martin Holloway's simple wooden casket entered the chamber at exactly 10:03. I sealed the door using the standard locking mechanism, verified the seal integrity, and activated the primary burners. Everything proceeded normally for the first 20 minutes. I monitored temperatures, updated records, and prepared urns for afternoon pickups. The retort functioned exactly as it should, maintaining steady combustion and proper airflow. At 10:27, I felt the door move. Not a vibration or thermal expansion. I know those sensations. This was pressure. Steady, deliberate pressure pushing outward from inside the chamber, as if something was leaning against the door from within. I stood immediately, approaching the retort with professional caution. The door showed no visible movement, no gap in the seal, no sign of mechanical failure. But when I placed my hand against the steel surface, I felt it clearly. Pressure, pushing outward, constant and steady, like someone pressing their weight against the door, trying to open it. At an 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, I checked the control panel, temperature, optimal, pressure differential, normal, safety interlocks, engaged. Everything indicated standard operation, but that pressure continued, unmistakable against my palm. I called my supervisor, Gerald, who arrived within 5 minutes. What's the problem? Feel this, I said, pressing my hand against the door. He placed his hand next to mine, waited, then shook his head. I don't feel anything unusual. The door is sealed and stable. There's pressure from inside, I insisted, like something pushing outward. Gerald examined the control panel, checked the safety systems, and studied the door mechanism carefully. Everything shows normal operation, Nadia. The door is functioning exactly as designed. But I could still feel it, that steady pressure, that sense of weight leaning against the steel, trying to get through. Are you feeling okay? Gerald asked, genuine concern in his voice. Maybe you should take a break. I can monitor this cremation. I'm fine, I said, though I wasn't certain that was true. I'll finish the process. Gerald left reluctantly, making me promise to call if anything else seemed wrong. I returned to my station, but I couldn't stop watching that door, couldn't ignore the sensation I'd felt so clearly. At 11:15, I approached the retort again. I placed both hands flat against the steel surface, pressing back against whatever pressure I'd felt before. It was still there, steady and patient, pushing outward with consistent force. Not violent or aggressive, just present. Like someone standing on the other side of a door, leaning against it while they waited. I tried to rationalize it. Gas expansion creating pressure against the door seal. Thermal dynamics I didn't fully understand. Some quirk of physics that mimicked the sensation of intentional pressure. But it felt too deliberate, too purposeful, too much like someone actually pressing against the door from the inside. The cremation continued. I checked the door every 15 minutes each time, feeling that same steady pressure. It never increased, never decreased, just maintained constant force throughout the process. At 12:45, the primary cycle completed. I began the cool down sequence, watching temperature gauges descend while that impossible pressure persisted. Even as the fire died and the chamber temperature dropped, I felt it. Someone waiting at the door. Patricia Holloway arrived at 1:30 for the ash pickup. I was processing Martin's remains when the front desk called to let me know she'd arrived early and would wait in the family room. I walked to the retort for a final check before completing the transfer. I placed my hand against the door. Nothing, no pressure, no sensation of weight or presence, just normal steel, cooling after cremation, exactly as it should feel. The pressure had stopped. I completed the processing quickly, transferred Martin Holloway's ashes to the urn Patricia had selected, and carried it to the family room where she waited. She stood when I entered, a small woman in her late 60s, wearing a gray cardigan and holding a worn purse. "Thank you for taking care of Martin," she said quietly. We sat together while I explained the paperwork and answered her questions. She held the urn carefully, studying the engraved nameplate with tired eyes. "Martin always waited by the door for me," she said suddenly. "For 47 years of marriage, every single day when I came home from work, he'd be standing at the door. Didn't matter if I was 5 minutes late or 2 hours late, he'd be there, waiting. After he retired, he had nothing else to do, so he'd just wait. Sometimes I'd see him through the window as I pulled up, standing there, watching for me." She touched the urn gently, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the smooth surface. Even when he got sick, even when the COPD made it hard to move around, he'd position himself near the door in his wheelchair. He couldn't stand anymore, but he'd lean against the door frame, waiting for me to come home. It was his way of saying he loved me, I think. Being there, always being there when I arrived. I thought about the pressure I'd felt, the steady weight leaning against the retort door for 3 hours, the sensation that stopped the moment Patricia Holloway entered the building. "He sounds like he was devoted to you," I managed. "He was," Patricia said softly. "I'm going to miss him, waiting by the door." She left 20 minutes later, carrying Martin's ashes and her grief. I watched through the window as she placed the urn carefully in her passenger seat, secured it with a seat belt, and drove slowly out of the parking lot. Then I returned to the crematory and stood before the retort door. I placed my hand against the steel, testing, checking, nothing, no pressure, no presence, just cold metal and empty space where fire had been. I've processed 87 cremations since Martin Holloway. I monitor each one carefully, checking the retort door periodically, testing for that strange sensation. Most cremations proceed without incident, the door remaining stable and unresponsive throughout the process. But I've felt it twice more since September. That steady pressure pushing outward, patient and deliberate, like someone leaning against the door from inside. Both times, the pressure stopped when the deceased's spouse arrived to collect the ashes. Both times, I learned later that the deceased had been the kind of person who waited, who watched for their partner's arrival, who positioned themselves by doors and windows, anticipating reunion. I don't report these incidents. I don't call my supervisor or ask colleagues if they've experienced similar phenomena. I just note it privately, documenting a pattern I don't understand and can't explain. Some people wait by doors their entire lives. Some habits become so ingrained they persist beyond death, beyond fire, beyond the physical body that once performed them. Some love expresses itself through presence, through waiting, through being there when someone arrives. Martin Holloway waited for his wife for 47 years, and on his final day, he waited one more time. Leaning against the door at 1800 degrees, patient and devoted, maintaining his vigil until Patricia arrived. Then he stopped, then he let go, then he finally came home. I think about that pressure sometimes, late at night when the facility is quiet. I think about the steadiness of it, the patience, the complete absence of panic or fear, just waiting, just being present at the threshold, just loving someone enough to stay by the door until they arrive. Even when the door is steel, even when the room is fire, even when everything else has already burned away. I heard my own prayer repeated back to me through the retort's air intake system, but I was the only person in the crematory, and the words that came back weren't exactly what I'd said. My name is Benjamin Cross, and I've operated the crematory at Westfield Memorial Gardens in Austin, Texas, for the past 10 years. I'm not a religious man by most definitions, but I maintain certain rituals in my work. Small gestures of respect for the dead, private acknowledgments of the transition we facilitate here. One of those rituals involves speaking a brief blessing before each cremation, nothing formal or denominational, just a few words recognizing the person who was, the life that ended. I've said these blessings thousands of times. They've always disappeared into the industrial noise of the crematory, absorbed by concrete walls and mechanical systems. Until the morning I heard them come back. The deceased was Robert Chambers, 68 years old, died after a 3-day coma following complications from surgery. His family had opted for immediate cremation, no service, minimal arrangements. The intake notes mentioned he'd been non-responsive for 72 hours before life support was withdrawn. Brain death, The paperwork said, no consciousness, no awareness, no presence in the body that remained. I began preparations at 8:30 a.m. The retort preheated normally, reaching operating temperature by 9:15. I verified Robert Chambers's identification tag, positioned his simple casket on the loading system, and prepared to engage the conveyor. Then I spoke my usual blessing, nothing elaborate, just a few sentences I've refined over the years, words that feel appropriate for this moment of transition. May you find peace in whatever comes next, I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the ventilation fans. May your journey be gentle, and may those who loved you find comfort in your memory. I activated the conveyor. The casket began sliding into the retort chamber, and I heard my own voice speaking from the air intake duct above my head. May you find peace in whatever comes next. I froze, hands still on the control panel, listening to words I'd just spoken repeating back to me. But it wasn't an echo exactly. The timing was wrong, the acoustics impossible. The ventilation system draws air into the facility from outside, not from the crematory. There's no mechanism for sound to travel backward through the intake ducts. But I heard my voice clearly, speaking words I'd just said. May your journey be gentle, and may those who loved you find comfort in your memory. The casket sealed inside the retort. I stood alone in the crematory, staring up at the air intake vent, waiting for the voice to continue. It did. But I'm still here. My voice, my tone, my cadence, but words I hadn't spoken. The burners ignited automatically. Fire filled the chamber, beginning the process of reducing Robert Chambers to ash and bone. I backed away from the control panel, my heart pounding, my professional composure fracturing into something close to fear. I'd never said those words. But I'm still here. That phrase wasn't part of my blessing, wasn't something I'd ever included in any ritual, but I'd heard it clearly, spoken in my voice, coming from the air intake system. I grabbed my phone and started a voice recording app. If this happened again, I needed documentation. I needed proof that I wasn't experiencing auditory hallucinations brought on by stress or exhaustion. The cremation continued normally for 30 minutes. The retort maintained proper temperature. The ventilation system operated at standard efficiency. No unusual sounds, no repeated voices, no phenomena I couldn't explain. Then, at 9:52, I heard it again. My voice, emerging from the intake duct. I'm still here. The recording app captured it. I played it back immediately, my hands shaking as I held the phone to my ear. Nothing. The recording contained only the ambient noise of the crematory, ventilation fans, burner roar, mechanical hums. My voice saying, I'm still here, wasn't there. But I'd heard it, clearly and distinctly, spoken in my own voice, words I hadn't said. I spent the next hour monitoring the cremation with hypervigilant attention, listening for any repetition of the phenomenon. The voice didn't return. The process completed at 11:20, and I began the cool-down sequence. As the temperature descended, I heard whispers. Not my voice this time. Multiple voices, overlapping and indistinct, creating a soft chorus of sound that seemed to emanate from the retort chamber itself. I couldn't distinguish individual words, couldn't separate one voice from another, just a collective murmur, like dozens of people whispering simultaneously. Then silence, complete and absolute silence as the chamber cooled. I processed Robert Chambers's remains with unsteady hands, running everything through the cremulator while my mind circled obsessively around what I'd heard. My voice repeating words I hadn't spoken, multiple voices whispering from a chamber that contained only ash and bone. The urn was ready by 1 p.m. No family had scheduled a pickup. The arrangements specified holding the ashes for estate processing. I placed the urn in secure storage and locked the crematory, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the building. I spent the afternoon researching Robert Chambers. Minimal information existed. No obituary, no social media presence, no public record beyond basic vital statistics. He'd lived quietly, died quietly, and left almost no trace of his existence. But I found a brief news article from 3 days before his death. A medical center had issued a statement about a patient who'd remained on life support after being declared brain dead, keeping him alive pending family consensus about organ donation. The article didn't name the patient, but the timeline matched Robert Chambers perfectly. 3 days, 72 hours on a ventilator, declared brain dead, but maintained artificially. Body alive, brain gone, consciousness theoretically absent. I thought about those whispers I'd heard. Multiple voices overlapping, indistinct and collective. I thought about my voice saying I'm still here when I hadn't spoken those words. I thought about the 3 days Robert Chambers spent in a state between life and death, his body functioning while his mind supposedly wasn't. And I wondered what he'd heard during those 3 days, whether some part of him remained aware, trapped in that transitional state, unable to communicate but still present, still conscious, still there. I've stopped saying blessings out loud. I still honor the dead, still maintain my rituals, but now I speak them silently in my mind, where they can't be repeated, can't be answered, can't echo back with words I didn't say. I've processed 143 cremations since Robert Chambers. Most proceed in silence, the way they should. No voices, no whispers, no impossible echoes traveling through ventilation systems. But sometimes I hear it. My own voice speaking from the air intake, repeating prayers I've just said. And occasionally, maybe once a month, those prayers come back changed. With additions I didn't make, with responses I didn't request, with words that sound like answers from somewhere beyond the retort chamber, beyond the fire, beyond whatever boundary separates awareness from absence. I'm still here. We're still here. Listen, remember us. I don't record these anymore. The audio never captures what I hear anyway. I just listen, acknowledge, and continue my work, because I think Robert Chambers was still there during those 3 days. Still aware, still conscious, still present in a body that machines kept alive while his family decided what to do with him. And I think he heard people talking around him, heard doctors discussing his case, heard nurses checking vitals, heard family members saying goodbye to a person they believed couldn't hear them anymore. I think he absorbed all those voices, all those words, all that ambient noise of a life ending while a body persisted. And I think when he finally died, when the machines stopped and his body followed, all those voices came with him. Into my crematory, into the fire, into the air that rises through the ventilation system, carrying ash and memory and the accumulated sounds of a man who spent 3 days hearing everything while everyone believed he heard nothing. I pray silently now, but sometimes the silence answers back. With my voice, with his voice, with all the voices that accumulate in the space between life and death, in the days when the body breathes, but the brain supposedly doesn't, in the hours when we declare someone gone while machines prove they're still present. I'm still here, the echoes say, and I believe them. Because I heard Robert Chambers speaking through the ventilation system at 1800 degrees, using my voice to tell me what no one wanted to acknowledge during those 3 days he spent dying, that he was aware, that he was listening, that he's still here somehow in the air that moves through this crematory, still speaking, still trying to be heard, still insisting on his presence in a world that declared him absent. I hear him sometimes, late in the evening when I'm closing the facility, my voice speaking from the intake ducts. I'm still here, and I answer silently, in my mind where the echoes can't reach. I know, I hear you, I remember, you're still here. I've photographed cremated remains for documentation purposes hundreds of times, but I'd never seen ashes arrange themselves into geometric patterns until a mathematician showed me that chaos has its own order. My name is Sophia Delgado, and I work as a crematory technician at Pinehurst Memorial Services in Boulder, Colorado. I've been in this profession for 9 years, developing meticulous protocols for every aspect of the cremation process. One of those protocols involves photographing the cremated remains immediately after removal from the retort, before any processing or transfer occurs. It's an extra safeguard, documentation that proves proper handling and provides a visual record should any questions arise. In 9 years and roughly 4,000 cremations, those photographs have always shown the same thing: random distribution of ash and bone fragments, scattered without pattern or organization, arranged by physics and fire into formations that follow no rules beyond entropy and heat distribution. Until Dr. Catherine Wells taught me that mathematics persists beyond death. She arrived on a Thursday morning in late November. The intake paperwork described her as 73 years old, retired mathematics professor, died peacefully after a brief illness. Her daughter had arranged for a simple cremation with no service, no viewing, just quiet completion of final arrangements. The intake notes included a detail I found touching. Dr. Wells had been obsessed with fractals, spending her final years writing papers about recursive patterns in nature, about how complex beauty emerges from simple mathematical rules repeated infinitely. Her daughter mentioned she'd want to be remembered for her work on spiral geometry and the mathematics of natural forms. I began the cremation at 9 a.m. Everything proceeded normally. Standard temperature, typical combustion patterns, no equipment anomalies. The process completed at 11:30, and I initiated the cool down sequence. At 1 p.m., I opened the retort to begin processing the remains. I've performed this task thousands of times, following the same careful procedure: visual inspection, photograph documentation, collection of bone fragments, transfer to the cremulator for final processing. I took the standard photograph, positioning my camera to capture the full interior of the retort chamber. Through the viewfinder, I noticed something unusual about the ash distribution, but I didn't study it carefully until I reviewed the image on my camera's display screen. The ashes weren't random. They formed a perfect spiral pattern, radiating outward from a central point with mathematical precision. Not a vague suggestion of organization, a genuine geometric spiral, the kind you see in nautilus shells or galaxy formations. The bone fragments were positioned along the spiral arms with spacing that looked too regular to be accidental. I stared at that image for a full minute, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Thermal currents in the retort could create movement in ash and small bone fragments. Airflow patterns might produce some organization, but this wasn't subtle. This was a clear, undeniable geometric pattern where no pattern should exist. I took 3 more photographs from different angles. Each one showed the same spiral formation, the same mathematical arrangement of remains that physics shouldn't allow. I collected the remains carefully, trying not to disturb the pattern more than necessary, though the act of collection inevitably destroyed it. I processed everything through the cremulator, transferred the ashes to the urn Dr. Wells's daughter had selected, and completed my documentation. But I couldn't stop thinking about that spiral. That evening, I researched fractal geometry and spiral patterns, trying to understand what I'd photographed. I found images of logarithmic spirals, Fibonacci sequences, golden ratio constructions, all showing the same basic form I'd seen in Dr. Wells's ashes. I found papers Dr. Wells herself had written, published in mathematics journals, exploring how spiral patterns emerge naturally from simple recursive equations, how the same mathematical principles govern seashell growth, hurricane formation, galaxy structure, and sunflower seed arrangement, how nature uses spiral geometry to organize complexity. I thought about her obsession with these patterns, her decades studying the mathematics behind natural forms. I thought about how that knowledge had shaped her understanding of the world, how she'd spent her final years writing about recursive beauty and mathematical order underlying apparent chaos. And I wondered if that understanding had somehow persisted beyond her death, organizing her remains into the pattern she'd studied for so long. Dr. Wells's daughter collected the ashes 3 days later. We sat in the family room while I explained the process and handled the paperwork. She held the urn carefully, studying the simple design with tired eyes. Mom would have loved this urn, she said quietly. She always preferred simple things that suggested deeper complexity, like how a single equation can generate infinite beauty through repetition. I hesitated, then retrieved my camera. May I show you something? I displayed the photograph of her mother's ashes, arranged in that perfect spiral pattern. Her daughter stared at the image, her eyes widening with recognition. "That's a logarithmic spiral," she whispered, "Mom's favorite mathematical form." She had images of these spirals all over her office: shells, galaxies, plants, everything that grows according to recursive principles. She touched the camera screen gently, tracing the spiral's curve with her finger. She used to say that mathematics was the language of the universe, that patterns exist whether we recognize them or not. She believed that at the deepest level, everything follows mathematical rules: growth, decay, life, death, all of it governed by equations we're just beginning to understand. She looked up at me, tears gathering in her eyes. "Did you arrange this somehow?" "No," I said honestly. "I found it exactly like this. I've never seen anything like it before." She studied the photograph for a long time, then asked me to send her a copy. I did, along with the other angles I'd captured, providing complete documentation of something I still couldn't explain. That was 3 months ago. I've processed 94 cremations since Dr. Wells. I photograph every collection of remains before processing, maintaining my documentation protocol with renewed attention. The spiral has appeared twice more. Both times, I researched the deceased afterward and found mathematical backgrounds. A computer scientist who'd worked on algorithmic pattern generation, a physicist who'd studied quantum mechanics and wave equations. Both times, their ashes arranged themselves into variations of the same spiral form, not identical to Dr. Wells's pattern, but clearly related. Mathematical, organized, impossible. I now keep a private archive of these photographs, stored separately from my official documentation. 3 spirals in 3 months, each one perfect and inexplicable, each one associated with someone who'd spent their life studying patterns and mathematics. I don't report these findings. Who would I tell? What would I say? That ashes organize themselves into mathematical patterns? That knowledge of geometry persists beyond death? That mathematics imposes order even on the chaos of fire and cremation? But I think about Dr. Wells's belief that mathematics governs everything, that patterns exist at the deepest level of reality, whether we recognize them or not. And I wonder if she was right. If the equations we learn, the patterns we study, the mathematical truths we internalize somehow become part of us so fundamentally that they survive the dissolution of the body. If knowledge shapes not just how we see the world, but how we exist within it, even after we're reduced to ash and bone. I photograph every cremation now with careful attention, looking for patterns in chaos, searching for order in randomness. Most remain scattered and unorganized, distributed by physics and fire without deeper meaning. But sometimes, maybe once every 30 cremations, I see it: a suggestion of organization, a hint of mathematical structure, ashes arranged according to principles that shouldn't govern their distribution. And I think about Dr. Wells, who spent her final years studying spiral geometry, who believed mathematics was the language of the universe, who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. She taught me something that day, through the arrangement of her own ashes. That patterns persist, that knowledge endures, that mathematics exists deeper than flesh, deeper than fire, deeper than the boundary between life and death. The spiral appears in my retort every few weeks now, always different people, always the same pattern, always impossible, always perfect. And every time I photograph those organized ashes, I think about Dr. Wells and her belief in recursive beauty, in patterns that repeat infinitely, in mathematics that governs everything, even the way we burn, even the way we end, even the way our ashes remember what we knew. The spiral teaches, and I'm learning to see. I recalibrated the scale 3 times, but the numbers didn't lie. Thomas Brennan's ashes weighed more than his body should have produced, and the extra weight told a story 40 years in the making. My name is Marcus Webb, and I operate the crematory at Riverside Memorial Park in Greenville, South Carolina. I've held this position for 17 years, developing an intimate understanding of the mathematics of cremation. Body weight translates to ash weight according to predictable ratios. A person who weighed 180 pounds in life produces approximately 6 to 8 pounds of cremated remains, depending on bone density and skeletal structure. These numbers vary slightly, but they follow consistent patterns I've learned to anticipate with reasonable accuracy. Until Thomas Brennan produced 11 pounds of ashes from a body that weighed 162 pounds. He arrived on a Monday morning in early October. The intake paperwork was straightforward. 84 years old, died peacefully in hospice care, no unusual circumstances. His daughter, Rebecca, had arranged for immediate cremation, selecting a simple bronze urn and requesting minimal services. The kind of quiet death that happens in nursing homes and hospice facilities every day, marked by relief as much as grief after a long decline. I began the cremation at 9:30 a.m. Everything proceeded normally. Standard temperature curves, typical burn patterns, no equipment anomalies or processing irregularities. Thomas Brennan was a small man, thin from age and illness, the kind of light frame that produces relatively modest ash quantities. The cremation completed at 11:45. I began the cool-down sequence, then processed the remains through the cremulator at 1:15 p.m. The bone fragments reduced to fine ash without incident, and I transferred everything to the collection tray for weighing. I placed the tray on my calibrated digital scale, a precision instrument. I check weekly against standardized weights. The readout stabilized at 11.3 pounds. I stared at that number, certain I'd misread the display. Thomas Brennan's medical records listed his final weight as 162 pounds. That should have produced approximately 6 pounds of cremated remains, possibly 7 for someone with dense bone structure. 11.3 pounds was impossible. I removed the tray and tested the scale with my standard verification weight. 10 pounds exactly. The scale read 10.0 pounds. Perfect accuracy. I weighed the empty urn, 1.8 pounds. I weighed the collection tray, 2.1 pounds. I weighed Thomas Brennan's ashes again, 11.3 pounds. The mathematics didn't work. Even accounting for metal from dental work or surgical implants, the weight was far too high, and I'd visually inspected the remains. No significant metal content, no prosthetics, nothing that would explain the extra mass. I sat at my desk for 20 flippable minutes, running calculations, checking my records against previous cremations. In 17 years, I'd never encountered a weight discrepancy this significant. Small variations were normal, but this represented nearly double the expected ash production. I considered calling Rebecca Brennan to explain the anomaly, but what would I say? Your father's ashes weigh more than they should. That sounded absurd even in my thoughts. I transferred the ashes to the bronze urn she'd selected, sealed it carefully, and logged the weight in my records. 11.3 pounds. Impossible, but undeniable. Rebecca arrived at 3 p.m. to collect her father's ashes. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 40s, with the exhausted appearance of someone who'd spent months watching a parent decline. We sat in the family room while I explained the process and handled the required paperwork. She held the urn carefully, testing its weight, then frowned slightly. This feels heavy. Is that normal? Cremated remains vary in weight depending on bone density, I said, which was technically true, even if it didn't explain the actual situation. Dad was such a small man toward the end, Rebecca said quietly. He lost so much weight in hospice. Sometimes I couldn't believe how light he felt when I helped the nurses move him, like he was already disappearing. She set the urn on the table between us, still studying it with that slight frown. I need to tell you something, she said suddenly. I don't know if it matters for your records, but Dad had a daughter before me, Melissa. She died in childbirth, stillborn at full term. Mom buried her in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery because they couldn't afford a proper memorial. This was back in 1983, before I was born. She touched the urn gently, her fingers tracing the engraved nameplate. Dad never got over it. He visited that unmarked grave every week for 40 years. He'd bring flowers even though there was no headstone, just a location he'd memorized. Row 7, plot 23. Mom told me he felt guilty that Melissa never had a proper resting place, never had anyone acknowledge her existence. Rebecca looked up at me, her eyes reflecting complicated grief. After Mom died 6 years ago, Dad became obsessed with finding Melissa's grave. He wanted to move her remains, give her a proper burial with a headstone. But the county had poor records from that era. They couldn't confirm which plot she was in. Dad searched for 2 years before the dementia got too bad. She stood preparing to leave, lifting the urn with both hands. I'm scattering half of Dad's ashes at the beach where he proposed to Mom, but the other half, I'm taking it to the county cemetery, to row 7, plot 23, where he spent 40 years visiting Melissa's grave. Even if I can't find her exact location, I want him there, with her, finally. I helped carry the urn to her car, settled it securely in the passenger seat. Rebecca thanked me for my care and drove away slowly, carrying her father's impossible weight. After she left, I returned to my office and pulled Thomas Brennan's file. I calculated the expected ash weight for a 162-pound man, approximately 6 pounds. The actual weight, 11.3 pounds. The difference, 5.3 pounds. I researched average weights for full-term stillborn infants. The medical literature gave a range of 5 to 8 pounds, with an average around 6 pounds. Cremated remains from an infant would produce significantly less ash than an adult, perhaps 12 ounces to 1 pound, depending on bone development. But a buried infant, decomposed over 40 years, would leave only bone. And bone weight doesn't decrease with decomposition. A full-term infant's skeleton weighs approximately 1 pound. If that skeleton somehow became part of Thomas Brennan's cremation, physically impossible but mathematically consistent, it might account for an additional 1 to 2 pounds of ash. But 5.3 pounds? I sat in my office until 6 p.m., running calculations that led nowhere, trying to rationalize impossible mathematics. Eventually, I locked my files and went home, carrying questions I knew I'd never answer. I've processed 362 cremations since Thomas Brennan. The weights follow expected patterns, clustering around predictable ratios between body mass and ash production. Standard mathematics, standard physics, standard results. But I think about that extra 5.3 pounds almost every day. I think about Thomas Brennan visiting an unmarked grave for 40 years, bringing flowers to a daughter who died before drawing breath, about his obsession with finding her, moving her, giving her the recognition she never received, about love that persists across decades, across death, across the boundary between marked graves and unmarked ones. And I wonder if grief has weight, if love can accumulate mass over 40 years of weekly visits, if devotion crystallizes into something physical enough to measure on a calibrated scale. I wonder if Thomas Brennan finally found his daughter somewhere between life and death, somewhere in the space where fire dissolves physical boundaries but can't quite reach whatever connects a father to the child he lost. I wonder if she came with him that morning, gathered into his ashes by forces I'll never understand, finally joined to the parent who never stopped searching for her. 5.3 pounds of impossible weight. 5.3 pounds of love that wouldn't let go. 5.3 pounds of a father who spent 40 years trying to bring his daughter home. I didn't mention the weight discrepancy to anyone. I just logged the numbers and locked the file. Because some mathematics transcends physics. Some equations solve themselves in ways that make no logical sense but perfect emotional truth. And sometimes cremated remains weigh exactly what they need to weigh. To carry everything that matters, to bring together what was separated, to finally make a father and daughter a whole. Even if the numbers say it's impossible, even if my scale proves it happened anyway. I watched frost form on the inside of an observation window at 1400 degrees Fahrenheit, and the pattern it traced told me everything about the children Michael Warren spent 20 years trying to forget. My name is Iris Caldwell, and I manage crematory operations at Lakeside Memorial Services in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've overseen this facility for 12 years, working with equipment designed to operate at temperatures that would vaporize most materials instantly. The observation window is tempered glass, rated to withstand prolonged exposure to extreme heat without cracking or degrading. It allows families to witness the cremation process while remaining safely separated from the intense thermal environment inside the retort chamber. Nothing should form on the inside of that window, not moisture, not condensation, not frost, especially not when the chamber is running at cremation temperature. But on a frigid January morning, I watched ice crystallize on glass exposed to 1400-degree heat, and the shapes it formed made me understand that some losses remain frozen regardless of fire. Michael Warren arrived on a Wednesday. The intake paperwork listed him as 58 years old, died of liver failure after years of alcohol abuse. No family attended his cremation, no service was planned. His ex wife had arranged for basic cremation and asked that the ashes be held for estate processing. The kind of lonely death that happens to people who've pushed everyone away, who've spent decades trying to drown memories that won't stay submerged. I began the cremation at 10 a.m. The retort preheated normally, reaching operational temperature by 10:30. I verified Michael Warren's identification, positioned his casket on the loading system, and activated the conveyor. Standard procedure, routine work, nothing to suggest the day would become anything other than ordinary. The casket entered the chamber. I sealed the door and monitored the process from my control station, watching temperature readings stabilize at 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. The observation window showed flames filling the chamber, consuming the casket with expected efficiency. At 11:15, I noticed something unusual on the window's surface. Frost, forming on the inside of the glass, the side exposed to 1400-degree heat. I stood immediately, approaching the window with professional concern overlaid with growing confusion. Ice crystals were spreading across the glass in branching patterns, growing despite the impossible thermal environment. I pressed my hand against the outside of the window, cool to the touch, as it should be, separated from the chamber heat by the glass itself. But the inside surface, the side facing the fire, was frosting over. The pattern wasn't random. As the crystals spread, they formed two distinct shapes, side by side. Small shapes, maybe them 8 inches tall. The frost traced clear outlines, childlike figures with rounded heads, simplified bodies, the kind of innocent human forms a young child might draw. And at the base of each figure, where hands would be, the frost formed small palm prints. Took child-sized, maybe 3 or 4 years old. Two sets of handprints, two simplified figures, twin shapes in ice growing clearer as the impossible frost thickened. I grabbed my phone and photographed the window, capturing the pattern before it could disappear. The image showed exactly what I was seeing: clear, undeniable, physically impossible frost forming detailed shapes at 1400 degrees. The cremation continued. The frost patterns remained stable, not melting, not evaporating, just present, like they'd been painted onto the glass by someone inside the chamber. The child-sized handprints stood out most clearly, perfectly preserved despite the surrounding fire. At 12:30, the primary cremation cycle completed. I initiated the cool-down sequence, watching the temperature gauge descend. The frost remained until the chamber dropped below 300 degrees. Then it vanished, not gradually melting, not slowly evaporating, just gone in an instant, leaving the glass completely clear as if it had never been there. I processed Michael Warren's remains in silence, my hands steady but my mind racing. I'd photographed the frost, documented its existence, captured evidence of something that violated every law of thermodynamics I understood. But I had no explanation for what I'd witnessed, no rational framework for frost forming inside a cremation chamber, no way to reconcile impossible ice with ordinary fire. Michael Warren's ashes were ready by 2 p.m. His ex-wife arrived an hour later to collect them, a tired woman in her early 50s, carrying grief that looked old and complicated. We sat in the family room while I handled the paperwork. She accepted the urn without emotion, holding it like something she was obligated to carry, but didn't want. "I need to tell you something," she said suddenly. "I don't know why I'm telling you, but it feels wrong not to say it out loud. Michael had sons, twin boys. They drowned when they were 3 years old, swimming pool accident, while Michael was supposed to be watching them. He'd been drinking. He fell asleep on the deck chair. The boys got into the pool." She stared at the urn, her face hardening with old anger and older pain. "It destroyed our marriage, destroyed Michael. He never forgave himself, spent 20 years drinking to forget what he'd done. I left him 5 years after the accident because I couldn't watch him kill himself slowly. The boys, Timothy and Nathan, I had them buried together, tiny caskets side by side. Michael never visited their graves, not once in 20 years, said he couldn't face what he'd lost, what he'd caused." She stood, preparing to leave. "I'm scattering his ashes at the lake where we used to vacation when the boys were babies, before everything fell apart. I figure he can have that memory, at least. The good time before he ruined everything." I showed her the photograph on my phone, the frost patterns, the child-sized handprints, the twin figures traced in ice inside a chamber running at 1400 degrees. She stared at the image for a long time, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. "That's them," she whispered. "That's Timothy and Nathan. Look at the handprints. That size, that's exactly right for 3-year-olds. They used to press their hands against windows, leaving prints on the glass. I spent years cleaning those prints away, and after they died, I'd see phantom handprints everywhere, remember everywhere they'd touched." She touched the phone screen gently, tracing the outline of those impossible frost prints. "Maybe Michael finally saw them," she said quietly. "Maybe at the end, in the fire, he finally faced what he'd been running from. Maybe the boys came to show him they were still there, still reaching for him, still pressing their hands against the glass between his world and theirs." She left 20 minutes later, carrying Michael Warren's ashes and that photograph, evidence of a reunion that shouldn't have been possible, but somehow was. I've processed 418 cremations since Michael Warren. The observation window functions perfectly. maintaining proper transparency, showing no signs of damage or degradation. The glass passes every inspection, but I've seen the frost 3 more times, always during cremations of parents who'd lost children to drowning, always forming the same basic pattern: small figures, child sized handprints, ice crystallizing at impossible temperatures. I photograph it every time now, documenting a phenomenon I can't explain and won't report. I keep the images in a private folder, evidence that some reunions transcend physics, that some messages get delivered despite every barrier between life and death. I think about Michael Warren spending 20 years drowning in alcohol, trying to forget 2 3-year-old boys reaching for their father in a swimming pool while he slept off his drinking. About the guilt that consumed him more thoroughly than my retort fire ever could. About Timothy and Nathan, frozen at 3 years old forever, waiting 20 years to press their hands against glass one more time to show their father they were still there, still his sons, still reaching for him. The frost forms at 1400 degrees. Ice crystallizes in fire. Children who drowned leave their handprints in impossible places. And sometimes the dead get to say goodbye, even when the living spent decades running away. Michael Warren never visited his sons' graves, but at the end, in the fire, they visited him. They pressed their small hands against the only window that mattered. They left their prints in frost that shouldn't exist. They showed him what he'd spent 20 years trying not to see, that they were still there, still waiting, still his sons, even in the cold, even in the fire, even in the space between impossible ice and unforgiving heat. I clean the observation window after every cremation now, looking for frost, hoping it appears, documenting proof that love persists at 1400 degrees, that children forgive their parents, that some handprints never fade, even when they're made of ice, even when they form in fire, even when they shouldn't exist at all. I use a voice recorder for process notes during cremations, but I never expected it to capture someone declaring their own presence from inside a sealed retort at 1800 degrees. My name is David Moreno, and I've operated the crematory at Westridge Memorial Services in Phoenix, Arizona for the past 15 years. I maintain detailed audio logs of every cremation, recording timestamps, temperature readings, and procedural notes throughout each process. It's an extra layer of documentation that saved me during equipment audits and helped train new staff. I've accumulated thousands of hours of audio, my voice narrating technical details, mechanical sounds of the crematory, the ambient noise of routine work. Until 3 months ago, those recordings had never captured anyone's voice except my own. The deceased was Jonathan Price, 67 years old, declared brain dead after a massive stroke. The intake paperwork noted he'd spent 3 days in ICU on life support before his family made the decision to withdraw care. A vegetative state, the medical record said. No consciousness, no awareness, no neurological activity that would indicate the person Jonathan Price had been still existed inside his unresponsive body. I began the cremation at 8:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Standard procedure: preheat the retort, verify identification, engage the loading system. I activated my voice recorder as Jonathan Price's casket entered the chamber, beginning my usual narration. Case number 4732, Jonathan Price. Cremation start time, 8:34 a.m. Initial temperature, 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Primary burners engaged. I sealed the retort door and returned to my monitoring station, continuing my audio log with periodic updates. Temperature readings, combustion observations, routine technical details. My voice filled the recorder with the mundane specifics of professional work. At 9:17, I noted a slight pressure fluctuation. Primary chamber pressure showing minor variation within acceptable range, adjusting secondary airflow to compensate. I made the adjustment, logged it, and continued monitoring. The cremation proceeded normally. Jonathan Price's body reduced to ash and bone with expected efficiency, following patterns I'd observed thousands of times. The process completed at 11:42. I recorded the end time, initiated cool-down procedures, and set the recorder aside while I prepared for the next cremation. That evening, after finishing my shift, I transferred the day's audio files to my computer for backup and archiving. I've done this hundreds of times, usually listening at accelerated speed while organizing documentation. Routine digital housekeeping that requires minimal attention. I played Jonathan Price's file at double speed, my voice sounding artificially quick and high-pitched as I narrated technical details. The audio ran normally until the 9:17 timestamp. I heard my voice noting the pressure fluctuation, primary chamber pressure showing minor variation within acceptable range, adjusting secondary airflow to compensate. Then, 7 seconds later, a different voice, not artificially sped up by the playback. Normal speed, normal pitch, despite the double speed setting, male voice, clear and close to the microphone, speaking 3 words. I'm still here. I stopped the playback immediately, my heart racing. I rewound to the 9:17 mark and listened again at normal speed, my voice, primary chamber pressure showing minor variation within acceptable range, adjusting secondary airflow to compensate. 7 seconds of ambient crematory noise. Then, I'm still here. The voice was distinct, separate from background noise, recorded with the same clarity as my own narration. Not a whisper, not a mechanical artifact. A clear spoken statement captured on digital audio. I checked the timestamp. 9:17. 23 minutes into Jonathan Price's cremation, with his body sealed inside a chamber running at 1800 degrees. I listened to the entire recording 3 more times. The voice appeared only once at that single timestamp. 3 words. I'm still here. I examined the audio file's metadata. No corruption, no tampering, no indication of post-recording modification. The file was continuous, unedited, exactly as recorded during the cremation. I spent 2 hours researching audio anomalies, trying to find rational explanations. Radio frequency interference, mechanical sounds forming speech like patterns, acoustic phenomena that might create the illusion of words where none existed. But the voice was too clear, too precise, too much like an actual human speaking directly into my recorder. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing those three words repeating in my mind: I'm still here. The next morning, I pulled Jonathan Price's full medical file from our records. The details were straightforward: massive hemorrhagic stroke, immediate loss of consciousness, flat EEG showing no brain activity, family consent for organ donation pending life support withdrawal. But buried in the nursing notes, I found something that made my hands shake. A nurse had documented unusual observations during Jonathan Price's 3-day ICU stay. Patients' eyes occasionally appear to track movement despite absent EEG activity, possible reflexive response. Neurology consulted, confirmed no cortical function present. Family advised patient cannot see, hear, or experience awareness. Another note from a different shift: patient's hand gripped my fingers when I was adjusting IV line. Reflexive grasp only per neurology. Patient remains in vegetative state with no consciousness. A final entry: 12 hours before life support withdrawal. Patient's lips moved as if attempting speech during morning care. No sound produced. EEG remains flat. No change in diagnosis. I thought about Jonathan Price spending 3 days in that state, eyes tracking movement. The doctor said he couldn't see, hand grasping fingers, while specialists confirmed he felt nothing, lips forming words no one believed he could think. I thought about what it would be like to be trapped inside an unresponsive body while everyone around you declared you absent. To hear doctors telling your family you're gone, to feel hands touching you while voices explain you can't feel, to try speaking while everyone agrees you can't think, to spend 3 days screaming silently that you're still there, still conscious, still present in a body everyone believes is empty. I thought about my voice recorder capturing 7 seconds of audio at 9:17 a.m., 23 minutes into a cremation that should have contained no conscious presence. And I thought about what someone might say if they'd spent 3 days unable to communicate, unable to prove their awareness, unable to make anyone understand. I'm still here. 3 words. Simple declaration. Impossible timing. I deleted the audio file that afternoon, erased it completely, wiped it from backups, removed every trace of those 7 seconds. I told myself I was preventing unnecessary distress, avoiding questions I couldn't answer, protecting my professional credibility. But I know the truth. I deleted it because I couldn't bear listening to it again, couldn't handle the implications of what I'd recorded, couldn't face what Jonathan Price might have experienced during those 3 days of supposed unconsciousness. I've recorded 73 cremations since Jonathan Price. My voice fills the audio files with technical narration, procedural notes, routine documentation. Everything sounds exactly as it should. Just me, talking to myself, logging cremation details while I work. But I back up every file now, compulsively, obsessively. I save multiple copies, archive them in different locations, Ensure nothing gets lost or corrupted because I need to know if it happens again. If someone else speaks from inside my retort, declaring their presence while fire consumes the body everyone believed was empty, I haven't heard another voice yet, just mine narrating endlessly, filling the silence with professional observations. But I listen carefully to every recording. I check every timestamp. I watch the audio waveforms for patterns that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm reviewing files, I pause at unexpected moments. Places where the ambient noise shifts slightly, where the recording quality changes for just a second or two. I listen to those moments repeatedly, turning up the volume, filtering out background noise, searching for words buried beneath the mechanical sounds of my crematory. Because Jonathan Price spoke through my recorder. He declared his presence after 3 days of being told he was absent. He proved awareness when everyone believed consciousness had ended. And I deleted the evidence because I wasn't brave enough to face what it meant. That sometimes we declare people dead while they're still listening. That sometimes we burn bodies that still contain awareness we can't detect or measure or acknowledge. That sometimes the person inside is still there, still conscious, still trying to tell us they haven't left yet. I'm still here. 3 words I can never unhear. 3 words I erased but can't forget. 3 words that made me understand that death's boundary is less clear than we pretend, and consciousness might persist in places we're too certain it can't exist. I record every cremation now, and I listen to every second, searching for voices, hoping I never hear them, terrified I will. In 15 years of crematory work, I'd never seen flames refuse to stay blue until the morning Dr. Helena Vance taught me that some poisons leave signatures even fire can't erase. My name is Ruth Carmichael, and I operate the crematory at Oakmont Memorial Services in Portland, Oregon. I've spent 15 years studying combustion, understanding how bodies burn, learning to read flames the way other professionals read charts or graphs. Fire communicates. It tells stories about temperature, oxygen levels, fuel composition, and combustion efficiency. Blue flames mean optimal burning, hot, clean, complete conversion of organic matter to ash. Yellow or orange flames indicate cooler temperatures or incomplete combustion. Red flames suggest insufficient oxygen. These colors follow rules. Chemistry dictates flame behavior with mathematical precision. I've cremated over 6,000 bodies, and the flames have always performed according to predictable patterns. Until Dr. Helena Vance arrived in a sealed casket on a cold November morning and the flames turned green. The intake paperwork described her as 73 years old, retired research chemist, died at home under hospice care. Advanced cancer, the medical records said. Palliative care, pain management, expected death. Her daughter had arranged for immediate cremation with minimal services, standard arrangements for a quiet death. I began the cremation at 9 a.m. The retort preheated normally, reaching operational temperature by 9:30. I verified Dr. Vance's identification tag, positioned her casket on the loading system, and activated the conveyor. Everything proceeded with familiar routine. The casket entered the chamber. I sealed the door and returned to my monitoring station, settling in for what I expected would be a completely ordinary cremation. The flames ignited at 9:37, filling the chamber with their usual blue-white intensity. Beautiful in their way, clean fire-consuming organic matter with efficient precision. I've always found comfort in that blue color, evidence that everything is working exactly as designed. At 9:52, the flames shifted, blue to green, not gradually, not mixed with other colors, just a complete transition from normal blue combustion to vivid green fire that shouldn't exist in my retort. I stood immediately, approaching the observation window to verify what I was seeing. The flames were undeniably green, bright, almost luminescent, filling the entire chamber with color that had no business appearing during ordinary cremation. I checked every gauge on my control panel. Temperature 1800 degrees, exactly where it should be. Oxygen flow, optimal. Gas mixture, standard composition. Nothing in my equipment explained green flames. I've researched combustion extensively. I know what makes flames change color. Copper compounds burn green. Barium salts produce green fire. Certain chemical additives used in pyrotechnics create green flames through metallic ion excitation. But none of those substances should be present in a human body. Even someone who'd worked with chemicals professionally wouldn't retain concentrations high enough to affect flame color during cremation. The green flames continued for 7 minutes. Then they shifted back to blue, returning to normal combustion patterns as if the green episode had never occurred. I logged the observation in my private notes, but didn't document it in official records. What would I write? Flames turned green for unexplained reasons. That would trigger equipment inspections, safety reviews, possibly even facility shutdown pending investigation. The cremation completed at 12:15. I processed Dr. Vance's remains through the cremulator, transferred the ashes to the urn her daughter had selected, and prepared for the afternoon's scheduled cremations. But I couldn't stop thinking about those green flames. That evening, I researched copper toxicity, metallic compound accumulation, any medical condition that might concentrate green burning elements in human tissue. The information I found suggested impossibly high concentrations would be necessary to affect flame color, levels incompatible with life. Dr. Vance's daughter collected the ashes the following day. We sat in the family room while I handled the paperwork and answered her questions about the process. Mom was a research chemist, she mentioned during our conversation. She worked for a pharmaceutical company for 30 years, developing compounds for various applications. She retired 15 years ago, moved to the coast, spent her final years gardening and traveling. She held the urn carefully, studying the engraved nameplate. She was diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, aggressive, fast spreading. The oncologists said they'd rarely seen that particular presentation, multiple tumor sites, unusual cellular behavior. They treated it as best they could, but the cancer seemed to resist every conventional therapy. I nodded, maintaining professional composure while my mind raced. Mom kept journals, her daughter continued, detailed notebooks about her work, her research, her theories. After she died, I was going through her study and found entries from her final months. She'd written about her cancer, analyzing it from a chemist's perspective. She had theories about what caused it, exposure to compounds she'd worked with decades ago, substances she'd handled before modern safety protocols existed. She paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. She wrote about copper based compounds specifically, research chemicals she'd synthesized in the 70s and 80s. Some were never approved for use, too toxic for commercial application. She thought long term exposure might have triggered her cancer, that traces of those compounds might still be present in her system. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Did she mention specific copper compounds? Yes. Technical names I didn't understand. She listed concentrations, molecular structures, absorption rates. She'd kept detailed records of everything she'd worked with, even substances from 40 years ago. She was trying to understand what killed her. Her daughter stood, preparing to leave. I brought copies of some of her journal entries, thinking maybe they'd be relevant for medical research. Would you like to see them? She handed me a folder containing photocopied pages. Dr. Vance's neat handwriting documenting years of chemical exposure, listing compounds by name and formula, noting estimated absorption levels and tissue concentrations. I found references to copper based research chemicals, compounds with technical designations I didn't recognize but could research later. Dr. Vance had estimated her lifetime exposure, calculated probable accumulation in various organs, theorized about long term effects. And in her final entries, written weeks before her death, she'd included a note. If copper compounds have accumulated as I suspect, cremation flames may show characteristic green color, final proof of what killed me. I sat alone in the family room after her daughter left, studying those journal pages. Dr. Vance had known. She'd understood that decades of chemical exposure had poisoned her slowly, accumulating in her tissues at levels that might persist even after death. She'd predicted the green flames. She'd documented her own poisoning with scientific precision. And I'd witnessed the proof burning at 1800 degrees. I researched the compounds she'd listed. Several were copper based research chemicals, discontinued in the early 90s when their toxicity became clear. Long term exposure could cause various cancers. Chronic accumulation was possible in liver and kidney tissue, and yes, high concentrations produced characteristic green flames when burned. I pulled Dr. Vance's ashes from the columbarium where her daughter had placed them temporarily. I contacted a private testing laboratory that specialized in elemental analysis. They found copper levels significantly elevated compared to normal human tissue, not impossibly high, but definitely abnormal. High enough to affect flame color during cremation, high enough to prove Dr. Vance's theory about what killed her, high enough to confirm that sometimes fire reveals secrets bodies carried for decades. I've processed 243 cremations since Dr. Helena Vance. Most flames burn blue, following standard combustion patterns, revealing nothing unusual about the bodies they consume. But I've seen green flames twice more. Both times, I researched the deceased afterward. Both had worked in industrial chemistry, metal processing, or pharmaceutical research. Both had careers that might have involved chronic exposure to metallic compounds decades before modern safety standards existed. Both carried poisons that persisted long enough to change how they burned. I document these cases privately now. I photograph the green flames when they appear, noting timestamps and temperatures. I research the deceased, looking for occupational histories that might explain elevated metal concentrations. And I think about Dr. Helena Vance, who spent her final months analyzing her own death, documenting the compounds that poisoned her, predicting how her body would burn. She turned her death into data, her cremation into evidence, her flames into proof. The green fire lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of visible testimony that she'd been right about everything. 7 minutes of chemistry overriding biology, of poisons declaring their presence even in 1800-degree flames. 7 minutes of fire remembering what her body couldn't forget. I keep Dr. Vance's journal entries in my desk. Sometimes I reread her notes, studying her careful documentation, admiring her scientific precision even in the face of her own mortality. She knew the flames would turn green. She predicted it with chemical accuracy. She left evidence for anyone trained to recognize what green fire means. That some exposures never heal, that some poisons persist beyond life, that sometimes the dead leave messages in the color of their burning. Green flames at 1800 degrees, proof written in fire, chemistry's final testimony, and now I watch for it, every cremation, every flame, looking for green among the blue, reading the colors, understanding what they mean. Dr. Helena Vance taught me that fire doesn't just consume, sometimes it reveals, sometimes it testifies, sometimes it shows us exactly what we're burning, and sometimes the flames tell stories bodies kept secret for 40 years, until fire made them visible, until green replaced blue, until chemistry spoke louder than silence. I watch the flames now. I read their colors. I understand their language. And when they turn green, I remember Dr. Helena Vance, who knew exactly how she'd burn, who documented her own death with scientific precision, who left proof in the color of fire. 7 minutes of green flames, 7 minutes of truth, 7 minutes that changed how I see every cremation. The fire reveals everything. If you know how to read it, if you're willing to see what the colors mean, if you understand that some bodies carry their stories all the way to the end, and the flames remember, always, the flames remember.